So we're now going to hand over to the next discussion section, which is going to be a very interesting side, which I think actually doesn't get as much attention as it should do. And I'm actually really fascinated to see how this one is going to work, because this is a very important side of the world of motor racing, the legal side and the accountancy section of motor racing, a very important part for anybody running an effective business in motor racing. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah Franklin of Sarah Franklin Solicitors and the Director of CORSE Concierge, Ella Barrington.
I appreciate this isn't the most glamorous subject, but it's one that is inevitable. So, I'm neither an accountant nor a solicitor, but what I do is an agency. It's not a creative agency like the wonderful people we've just heard of. We're more of the practical bits. So we are rooted in motorsport. We don't just work with motorsport businesses anymore, but we use the lesson we've learned in motorsport to help all sorts of small businesses. So we're innately curious. We're always trying to find new solutions. We've always got a plan. We're motorsport people. So we work in short bursts, which means you don't have to have full-time employees doing all the behind-the-scenes stuff. So we do sales and marketing, project management and operations, digital solutions, and we also have an ongoing concierge service. So you need stuff to happen, we can do it. We can also combine all of these for integrated white label support. So we act as a sales department for some companies, the customer service for others. So we work on-site for clients, we work on event, we work completely remotely for some other companies. We can work on a project basis, and then we also have a lot of retained customers we're currently working with. So I've taken one aspect of legal and one aspect of accountancy. But I hope you can appreciate these are very, very large subjects. But there's two pieces of legislation that have come out recently that, contrary to many myths you hear, you do need to take heed of, even in motorsport. So the first is GDPR. Everybody's favorite. You received a lot of emails, and you all hated people like me for sending them. But it isn't just something that's about mailing lists. It isn't just for big companies, and it isn't going away. So GDPR is General Data Protection Regulations, and Brexit isn't going to change anything. This has gone through the UK Parliament as the Data Protection Law of 2018. So even if we leave the EU, I optimistically said if, when we leave the EU, this is already in our statute, so it isn't going to change. In the UK, it's enforced by the Information Commissioner's Office, and they can now charge 4% of global turnover for non-compliance. Under the old Data Protection Act, you could only be charged £500,000, and as you may have seen in the news this week, for the whole of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook got £500,000. I bet they've made that in the time that I've been stood up here already. So now it's based on global turnover, and we're going to start seeing big businesses and small businesses taking heed of this. Not many people have got a pot with 4% of their global turnover ready to pay this fine. So, data. We're used to data in motorsport, car data, driver data, but GDPR has a different sort of data. Personal data and personal sensitive data. Personal data is anything that can identify a living individual directly or indirectly. It includes names, addresses, dates of birth, email addresses, perhaps your MSA license number. What is important to remember is names and email addresses. So you might not think you've got personal data in your tiny little race team, but if you've got names and email addresses, you do. It doesn't matter whether they're employees or suppliers or customers. They are people you can identify. It is personal data. You must protect it under GDPR. We then have another category, which is a defined list, which is up there. So this is anything that can be used to discriminate against somebody. Particularly in the case of employees, you may hold this information. You must protect this at the highest level. Restrict access, and don't ask for it if you don't need it. So even if you are a driver, the likelihood is you're going to have sponsors' names, email addresses saved on your iPhone, on your laptop. It is personal data. You need to be protecting it. You also have to have a lawful basis for processing any personal data under GDPR. They can be consent, that's permission. That's all those emails you received on the 24th of May saying click here. But that's not the only way you can process data. You can do it as part of a contract, part of a legal obligation. If you're a doctor, you can use vital interests. If you're a policeman, you can use public task, or you can use a legitimate interest. You must have a reason for processing, storing any data, and it must fit in one of those categories. All sounds pretty onerous so far, but for you as an individual living in the EU, it's really good news. And we will look back in 5 years' time and think it was a really great turning point. It wasn't just about emails and mailing lists. You now have the rights to review, update, delete, and limit the use of your personal information. You can make a subject access request to any organisation. So any organisation that's GDPR compliant, you can ask them to show you everything they know about you. I fully suggest you do this. Choose an Amazon, a Facebook, a Google. Go and do this. If you don't think data protection and privacy is an important matter, you will after you've done that. The ICO are actually good guys as well as bad guys, and they will help you sort out anybody that isn't behaving. But my one piece of advice for today is make this more than policies. Don't just write these and file them in a cabinet somewhere. Think you've got a privacy policy on a website and that you've done your bit. 95% of data breaches are caused by human error. You've got to train your staff. You've got to communicate with everybody. With your employees, it isn't just a legal obligation that you need to protect their privacy. It builds trust with them. As an employee, you have a lot of information about people. You need to build their trust. Check your website cookies. I read a lot of privacy policies, and the cookies are usually not what it says on their privacy policy. Don't just put Google Analytics. And you need to be ruthless with your database. If you don't have those legal basis for processing, please don't use them. And it all comes down to a really personal question. Would you like someone else to do this with your data? If the answer is no, you shouldn't be doing it in your business. So, quick whiz through to the world of accountancy. There's another law that's changing. The government want to make us a tax-efficient digital society, so we're making tax digital. So for VAT-registered businesses, if you're over the VAT threshold, you're now going to be required by HMRC from 1st of April next year, new financial year, to be using a piece of software. So no more spreadsheets. You must be using an approved piece of software to submit your VAT returns. And it's going to become mandatory in 2020 for all businesses. You can also start to use it for income tax. So if you're self-employed, or even if you just rent a single property, you can switch to digital record keeping now as part of a pilot scheme. You do it all online. You don't need to do the onerous self-assessment every January. And you'll be able to see how much tax you owe as you go along, which is avoid any nasty surprises at the end of the year. So choose your software. Personal recommendation, Xero is great. QuickBooks is the second best. Use it to record all your income expenses every 3 months. Hit that submit button. It'll send it to HMRC. You can then make that view of where you are at. At the end of the year, you can pop in your claims, your tax reliefs, and you'll see your calculation. Pay it, and then you can start using those numbers to plan for next year. It's no longer going to be we'll wait to see what the accountant says. You can see this in real time. So you can pay your tax more often. You can pay it as you go. You can still ask your accountant or somebody like my team to do this for you. You can budget and forecast more effectively. We are great at race strategy as an organisation, as an industry, but we're not actually sometimes that great at doing that in the business element. So remember, turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash flow is king. These tools, although government mandated, will make you run more effectively. So you need to build up your business toolbox. For GDPR, if you go to the Information Commissioner's Office website, there's loads of tools. Start mapping your data, thinking where it all is. Please don't just cut and paste policies off the internet. I'm not trying to sell you policies. I've got a wonderful team at Data Basics who can do that for you, but it's not one size fits all. Remember to communicate all the time and keep updating and evolving. So for making tax digital, I would fully suggest getting yourself on the pilot scheme now. GDPR people had 2 years to prepare for, but most people decided to start it 2 weeks before. This is what's going to happen with this, so start it now. If you've got a good accountant, they'll be telling you about it now. If not, I can make you a brilliant recommendation for an accountant. And find what tools work for you. As I said, I think Xero, Receipt Bank, and MyLIQ are great, but you've got to find something that works for your style of business. And with everything accountancy, do little and often. If not, it becomes a big job at the end of the year that no one wants to do. And then use the numbers you've got. Cash flow forecasting is incredibly important. And if you don't want to do it, if you don't like the nuts and bolts bit, if you want to go racing and not do policies and paperwork, that's what my team are here to do. So, over to you, Sarah.
Good morning, everybody. One thing I would add to that, what Ella's just mentioned, from personal experience, never, ever, ever accept bank details via email, even if it seems to come from within a company. There was a recent case where a firm of solicitors, somebody in the accounts department got an email from what they believed to be the senior partner saying, please send £234,000 to da-da-da-da-da-da. And they did it. They thought it was an internal email from their senior partner. It had been hacked. That was never recovered, that money. Gone. So never, ever, ever. If somebody emails you bank details, always verify it. With the data protection as well, Ella's already mentioned having a policy is really, really important, but it's also reviewing it as well. Because if you have a legitimate interest to have some data protection, doesn't mean you'll have that legitimate interest in a year's time. If you're running a race team and you've got your driver's details, and then they're no longer running with you anymore, what is your interest in keeping that information? And your policy should say that you review things on a regular basis and dispose of data if it's no longer relevant and you can't use one of those 6 things. So data protection is a minefield. Speak to people who know about it. Anyway, going on from that, little bit from me. I'm Sarah Franklin, and I race myself. I've been racing since 2004. I've been in all sorts of things, came to Ginettas initially, G20s, bit Porsche Carrera Cup. More recently, I've been doing Clio, the Michelin Clio Series. So I've been involved in motorsport as a driver and parts of a team for many years. And my day job is I'm a lawyer. I've got my own practice. And certainly over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've been doing predominantly work within motorsport. And as much as we like it or not, the law permeates every aspect of our lives, day to day. And in motorsport, that is still true. So I thought, I've got a very short period of time. What can I talk about that's actually interesting? So I thought I'd just point out the sort of areas that it's really, really important when law comes into place. The first one, motorsport is notorious for still doing things on a handshake. It happens all the time. I'm sure you've all come across it, that people, oh yes, I'll do that, and let's do that deal, and this, that, and the other, and nothing's ever written down. That makes my job really difficult when it goes wrong. So having simple contracts, and they don't have to be really complicated, make sure if you come to an agreement with somebody, you just drop them an email just saying, just to confirm our conversation today, this is what we're going to be doing. It confirms the expectations. Transport agreements. I've been involved with Formula One transport agreements where if you're moving very expensive equipment from A to B, you need to make sure that whoever's doing it for you is insured, the person who's driving is following all the time regulations. There's just so much involved in just transporting vehicles, especially if you're taking them outside of the UK. Sponsorship agreements, really, really important to have those in writing because, again, it's the expectation. What is both parties expecting? They're going to give you a lump sum of money to go racing, but what are they getting in return? So having a sponsorship agreement is really important as well. disputes. This always happens. Things break down, relationships break down. That's when it's all becoming messy. And that's when having stuff in writing to start with is really, really important. Debts. Debts is always a big thing in motorsport. Somebody owes somebody money, and again, if it's on a handshake, it's really difficult to enforce it, but it is still possible. It's not impossible. So that's one area where the law is really important. The next thing is this. Does anybody know what this is? These are the regulations. When you get your race license, a copy of this comes with your race license and a disc with a digital version on. I can bet you any amount of money that 95% of race drivers don't even open it, have no idea what's in this whatsoever. And yet this could make you lose your license, it could make you get a massive fine. There's been some high-profile decisions from the National Court fairly recently where high-profile drivers have been banned for a few years. This is what it's all about, guys. And you don't have to read all of it, because there's different sections for different types of racing. There's rallying, there's circuit racing, there's karting, so you don't expect to know the whole lot. The most important section probably is section C, which is the judicial bit if you do something wrong. The National Court, and this is really, really important, and a lot of people still don't understand this, the National Court is entirely separate from the MSA. Okay? So the MSA is the governing body for motorsport in the UK. If you do something wrong and you appeal the decision of the clerk of the course or the stewards, depending on whether you're circuit racing or karting, it can go to the National Court. The National Court can deal with appeals, it can deal with disciplinaries, so it can haul you up if it thinks you've done something wrong, and that's officials as well as and team bosses and individuals out there that are members of teams. It's not just the racing driver that can get hauled up before the National Court. They also have inquiries, the ability to look at what's happened, change results if there's been something that's gone wrong. And so the National Court sits normally about once a month. And at the moment, I represent the MSA on all of their National Court cases. People need representation if they're going to get hauled up before the National Court, because at the end of the day, if you've not read this, you need to have somebody on your side that has. And making sure, because you could lose your license as a result of it, not just immediately, but for a long period of time as well. Knowing the regulations is also obviously on your championships as well. So it's not just the rules that the MSA put in place, and they do change. I mean, again, I don't know, a lot of people don't sign up to the rule changes. If you go onto the MSA website, you can sign up so that when a rule is changed, and sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's future, but you do get notified, and you'll get an email that says this is what's coming into force in 6 months' time, or what's coming into force now. So you can't, ignorance is no defense. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that before. And you need to know what the provisions are, because if you get hauled up before the National Court, then it's really important to know what the current law is. So as a lawyer, I deal with lots of different aspects within the motorsport world. I don't know if those of you that were here earlier, and we were speaking to Karen Chanduk, and he was talking about getting rid of Friday practices because Formula One world is divorce central, because it's not conducive to family life. That's also true. I do an awful lot of divorce work for people within Formula One teams because it is not conducive to family life, and it often splits up couples and families. So being a lawyer within motorsport is really important, I think, for me, because it's part of my passion as well, because of the racing that I do. And I think understanding what actually happens is important, especially when we do cases where one of the most common is appeals, where there's been an incident between two vehicles and one of them's been excluded. They've appealed it to the stewards have upheld it, and then they've taken it to the National Court. Well, at that point, the only evidence you're going to have is normally the drivers. Sometimes you might have some in-car footage as well. And the panel of the National Court isn't always motorsport driven. In fact, most of them are not involved in motorsport, or they're more involved in the technical side. So actually being able to interpret data, being able to look at footage and say, well, that's not the normal line that you would take, and that's exceeding track limits and things like that, is important so that we can tell the court exactly what should and shouldn't happen. And it is so important. I mean, there is a very high-profile championship that the championship will be decided very soon in the national court. The championship's finished, it's done, but the champion could be changed as a result of a hearing that's about to take place. So this is not silly stuff. This is really important and can affect a lot of people. And when motorsport is so, it costs so much money, there's so much money in motorsport, you can throw an awful lot of money away by just not following the rules and regulations. What I tend to do is I'm at the end of the phone to a lot of teams as well, so I get a call on a Sunday afternoon saying, Sarah, this has happened, that's happened, what do we do, is it okay, can we argue it, before they actually go before the clerk of the course or the steward. And that's useful as well because, as I say, 95% of people probably won't even have this with them, let alone have read it. And I can say, yes, under this regulation, you're okay, don't worry about it. So, a lot of people think law's boring. It's really not. It's really important, and to make sure you get it right because it can have dire consequences if you don't. So that's really all I wanted to say, and so we wanted to open it up if there was any questions.
There now, yes.
There you go.
I was just quite fascinated to hear about it because it's a side of motor racing that we don't really spend too much time on, and we ultimately should, because without this side of it, I mean, we could be breaking goodness knows how many laws along the way. And I find that particularly relevant that people who are wanting to get into motor racing, it's a side of it that is very often neglected. And although it seems like paperwork, numbers crunching, but without it, you can't actually build a successful race team or a race business.
Yeah, I think the problem is it only ever becomes an issue if it goes wrong. You know, you can work on handshakes and being all happy and great, but if it goes wrong, then that's when there's a problem. And that's normally when it comes to me. So I'd rather see people at the beginning and get something in black and white so it doesn't go wrong than have to deal with it once it does. And there's nothing in place that says this is what you're doing and this is what I'm doing.
And of course, having been involved in this now for quite a while, Ella, I mean, looking at how it's evolving and where it's going, I mean, is it becoming easier to manage as we evolve and technology develops, or is it becoming harder?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely getting easier. There's so many tools that you can use if you just embrace them. And I think, to sort of follow on to the earlier question, so many people come into motorsport because it's their passion, it's their hobby, and all of a sudden, it's a business. And motorsport is a business. It's a workplace, you're an employer, you have legal obligations and financial obligations to make. And that can get lost because we all just want to be down there. But equally, if you are providing a workplace for people, you need to be compliant for your own peace of mind and for those that work for you.
It's fascinating stuff, and I'd love to hear more about it. So I'm sure if anybody else has more they want to discuss, you can find Ella and Sarah. Sarah, you have your own stand here, I believe?
No, but I'll hang around here if
You'll hang around
here.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. Well, a massive thank you to Ella Barrington and Sarah Franklin. Thank you very much indeed, ladies. Thank you.